Across the Xbox family of consoles, there's been over 147 games that were supposed to be exclusive that ended up getting canceled altogether. And we're looking at every single one of them. But first, let's look at the Xbox One because there's only a handful of games that we know about that were canceled exclusives planned, but they were pretty massive projects, not just like little small developer studios that fell off. These are some of the biggest games that have ever been Xbox exclusives that would then be canceled. Obviously, one of the biggest and most notorious Xbox One exclusive games that got canceled was Scalebound, which was developed by the very popular Platinum Games. They have a huge catalog of titles that have been widely successful, so it was very surprising that Scalebound ended up falling apart. Scalebound was created as a concept for a dinosaur game for the Wii all the way back in 2006 by Platinum Games before they would move on to develop Bayonetta. Right after Bayonetta's development though, these concepts were reconsidered and the first prototype was created for Scalebound. Now the title would be shopped around for a bit and it would take until 2013 before development on Scalebound officially began, all before it was announced as an Xbox One exclusive in 2014 with this really cool CGI trailer. Now Platinum Games had a great reputation, so this announcement was met with a lot of interest, and in 2015 we would actually see more gameplay, and that's where things maybe took a little bit of a shift. The gameplay was rather rough. Just from watching it, you could see that the game was still in a pretty unfinished state and was even suffering from a pretty low frame rate and stale animations. What did look finished though were these cutscenes, but this was already late 2015 and the game was supposed to release in 2016, so it wasn't really a huge surprise when the game would be delayed until 2017. But what was very surprising is this game that was hugely ambitious was ultimately canceled. I mean, Microsoft was doing their best to drum up a lot of good PR about this game, showing off the game in some of the largest showcases. But with the cancellation announcement, the project that started essentially all the way back in 2006 was officially dead. And we never really got a reason besides some vague statement like, yeah, both sides failed, or citing a lack of experience in the studio side as a fault. To this day though, the game is still talks every time E3 or some Xbox event that's like the replacement to E3 would roll around. So a lot of people really hope to see Scalebound revived in one way or another. There's always those fake leaks suggesting that Scalebound is coming out, and even to this day, higher ups at Platinum Games have stated that if Microsoft would allow them, they would love to continue development on the game, but as of now, there's no information about Scalebound ever returning. Then there was the famous or infamous Fable Legends. There was a time where Fable would get a ton of spin-off games. It had a casino type game, a golf game, a Connect game, a beat 'em up game, all in the short span of like, what, 4 years? Well, Fable Legends was supposed to be the next massive Fable spin-off that would have been a co-op action RPG utilizing the Unreal Engine 4, and when the game was first shown off, it actually looked kind of cool. This was back in 2014. Now, Fable Legends would have been a live service game with an expected life cycle of 5 to 10 years, which is pretty impressive. And yeah, there's a timeline out there where we got the 10th year of Fable Legends support just recently. Now, plans were to release the game as a free-to-play game in 2015, but it was delayed to 2016 with an open beta announcement the same year. The beta, which went public, was decently received and some players liked it, but in a shocking twist, Microsoft would close the studio and cancel Fable Legends mid-open beta. The beta would end April 2016, and anyone who purchased microtransactions would be refunded, and that would be the last we'd ever hear of Fable Legends. And Lionhead Studios, who had been working on the Fable franchise for years at that point, would close down, and that would be it for Fable for quite some time. It's very unlikely we'll ever see Fable Legends back since that studio is now long gone, and we're still waiting for that new Fable game with a new studio that they announced a few years ago, and who knows if that's ever coming anytime soon with all of the rumors that have come out of that studio regarding development on the next Fable game. And apparently Microsoft already pumped $75 million into the project before canceling it, making it the most expensive video game development at the time, only having gotten beaten out by Star Citizens and Cyberpunk in recent years. And then there was the announcement for Phantom Dust 2. Now, the original Phantom Dust is actually a personal favorite of Phil Spencer, and was so convinced of the gameplay being ahead of their time that Microsoft would eventually decide to make a multiplayer-only version of Phantom Dust that would have served as somewhat of a reboot/sequel. Now, when reading that they wanted to make this game for the growing esports community, it's kind of an odd odd and cringy choice, just seems kind of out of touch here, but they must have realized at some point how stupid that is and wanted the studio Darkside to make a single player campaign on top of the multiplayer, but on its original budget, which sounds kind of impossible. And then things get even weirder though when Microsoft announced the game in 2014 with a trailer that the studio developing the game had never seen and didn't even know that it was being shown. And then on top of that, the studio felt like the trailer misrepresented the game that they were working on. This sounds like 50 Shades of Halo 5 all over again. Then after that, a few months later, Microsoft removed the studio from the project and tried to find a new studio to take over development, but there was never a Phantom Dust 2 released, so either they're still looking or the project quietly and swiftly died. The last time anything Phantom Dust related came up was 2016 when they announced the re-release of the original game with a slight upgrade to being playable on Xbox One for 2017, but that's about it for Phantom Dust as a franchise, it seems like, at least for now. There was a launch title for the Xbox One that never actually made its way to release, known as Stormlands, which was being developed by Obsidian Entertainment, who had a pretty good track record at this point under their belt. Apparently the game was supposed to be ambitious like the Witcher RPG series tied with an MMO aspect. Apparently there would be massive bosses in these open shared worlds, and the game would seamlessly matchmake 40-man raids together, which is crazy. What's really interesting though is this game was in development for quite a while and cost Microsoft probably a pretty penny to establish the exclusivity with it. But with this game being set up to be an Xbox One launch title, Xbox also was working on a ton of other projects, like they were trying to focus on the Kinect, they were trying to focus on their whole like television, DVR, TV experience, and the game ended up getting canceled, though shortly after the cancellation of the game, Microsoft went ahead and acquired Obsidian, but didn't choose to continue any more work on Stormlands, and not too much more is known about this game other than it could have been a really big game. Okay, let's switch gears and look at the Xbox 360 for a second, because there's a very interesting array of games from this era that you might not even know about fully. After the departure of Bungie from Microsoft and them leaving the Halo franchise, Microsoft toyed around with a couple of ideas before establishing 343 Industries. It's been confirmed that for a while, Microsoft was close to inking a deal with Gearbox to take over the Halo franchise and release one or two more games after Bungie departed from the franchise. However, the decision was then changed to create 343 Industries. Also, during the time that Halo 4 was in development, Microsoft originally eyed to see the Halo franchise become a yearly released game, and in an older video on our channel, we actually uncovered that there likely was a tech demo for a new Halo title being prototyped by a studio known as Microsoft Game Studios of Vancouver. And for a small amount of time, this studio may have even been planned to be renamed to 343 Industries Vancouver, and when we were doing research on this, our sources even suggest that the game would have been built in the Unreal Engine. While there is concept art speculated to be a part of this canceled prototype, it seems like the game was never greenlit for full-on development, and it also seems like the studio was soon renamed again to Black Tusk Studio, and a different game was being prototyped for an Xbox exclusive title that would have been a AAA big budget game that would have been only on the Xbox 360 or the Xbox One. We did get a brief demo trailer of this game that was in development, though it didn't really show too much, but at least hinted at this big project. However, this mysterious Black Tusk project would also end up getting canceled, as the decision was then made to move this studio into taking over the Gears of War franchise, begin development on the Gears of War Remastered and Gears of War 4 and 5. The studio would then also be renamed to the Coalition. That's not the only Halo spin-off game though that has been canceled altogether. We also know that there were plans for a Halo MMO game known as Project Titan that was being developed by Ensemble Studios, the creators of the original Halo Wars game, and it had made its way through pre-production and early development before the game was altogether canceled. Now, we don't fully know for sure that this would have been a console release as well as a likely PC release, but it has always been an intriguing part of Halo history knowing that there was an MMO at one point planned that never came into fruition. Then there was also a Halo Mega Bloks game that was considered for development, and a prototype of the game was created and pitched pitched to Microsoft for what a Halo Mega Bloks game would have looked like. It's pretty interesting. The first level was mostly completed, though it does reuse assets from previous Halo titles like music and sound effects. And while this looks incredibly promising for a Halo title, especially for the 360, the game was not picked up by Microsoft and no further development was ever made on this Halo Mega Bloks game. A lot of you may know that they did a full Xbox 360 arcade remake of the original N64 Perfect Dark, and not only does the game play a lot better, it looks visually clearer, and it was a pretty solid remake for its time. It appears though that Microsoft also had planned on originally remaking GoldenEye, the classic N64 game that was hugely popular, and had gone through the entire process of fully remaking the game just to find out that they wouldn't have the full rights to release the game due to the rights to this game being split 3 different ways. Because of this, the game would end up being shelved and never released until recently a developer version of the game leaked online, and players with modded Xboxes were able to play through this GoldenEye remake in its entirety. Nowadays, GoldenEye is on Game Pass, but it's just the original version, and the remastered version from the late 2000s, early 2010s never did see the light of day, officially at least. There was also a game known as Demonic that was announced for the Xbox 360 exclusively that would have been published by Majesco Entertainment and developed by a studio known as Terminal Reality. Essentially in the game, you would have played as a demon summoned to Earth by humans who are looking to get revenge against those who have done them wrong, and you'd have like supernatural powers. They showed off a little bit of this game, though Majesco Entertainment ended up running into serious financial problems and the game ended up being canceled. There was also a game known as Voodoo Nights, which was going to go for the Xbox 360 and PC. The game apparently would have been a buddy cop magic type game, which sounds kind of crazy, but also would have had a lot of elements to make it like a story-driven movie game. You'd play as 2 police officer characters, but eventually would get some dark magic powers, and that sounds kind of crazy. The game was announced in 2005, but it seemed like it was quietly canceled soon after, likely due to lack of money and interest from the publishers. There was also a game for the Xbox 360 known as Totems, which would have mixed modern day world events alongside fantasy, along with North American indigenous folklore. There'd be elements of action, platforming, and parkour, which would all tie it together, though we only ever saw a teaser for this game, and the game would be canceled sometime about a year later. In 2005, the studio Novorama was working on a game called Wild Summer, which would have been maybe something similar to Rockstar's Bully game, where you'd play as a young character in this open world, use parkour moves, and like run around and do missions and whatnot. Apparently you'd be able to go and get yourself in all types of trouble. There was a little bit released for an E3 teaser trailer, but outside of that, the game would soon be canceled shortly after. In the late 2000s, Microsoft actually held an interesting contest known as the Dream Build Play Contest, which would allow developer teams that were smaller to make a prototype for a game, and the winners would receive funds to complete and publish the project. There's been some notable games that have come out of this project, like Dust and Elysian Tale, but in 2009, a game known as Max Blastronaut was revealed and actually ended up winning the contest. It looked like an interesting shoot 'em up, beat 'em up type co-op game, which would have been great on the Xbox Live Arcade, though the game never ended up releasing, and not too much is actually known about whatever came of this game. The development team Techland, who's known for Call of Juarez, Dead Island, and Dying Light, in 2007 was planning on working on a game known as Warhound, which would have been an RPG first-person game that was in an open world, and you'd be able to approach the gameplay in whatever direction you wanted. It seemed like it was maybe inspired by games like Far Cry and Crysis. It seemed like the game was pretty far in development, but ended up getting canceled as the team likely had to focus their efforts on games like Call of Juarez, Bound in Blood, and then Dead Island. And it's possible some of these ideas were then implemented into those titles, though this game never saw its own release. Still, the gameplay looked kind of interesting. For something back in the mid-2000s, late 2000s, this was probably really ahead of its time. It would have also had its own multiplayer functionality, allowing up to 32 players, which also was really ambitious, though nowadays nobody really remembers this title. There's a game known as Dog Tag that was announced to likely come out on the Xbox 360 and would have been developed by a studio known as Diesel Power, but was to be published by a British publisher known as Digital Jesters. The game was a third-person squad-based shooter. It would have had a lot of the slower tactical style of gameplay, with cover being a huge part of the game, much like Gears of War, and would have maybe tackled some pretty dark topics when it comes to like modern war. However, later on in 2005, the publisher Digital Jesters ended up having a bunch of controversy around their company and a lot of accusations against them regarding things like lack of payment for games, doing business under different business names to attempt to hide or escape from financial troubles. They were facing legal action. There was a ton of things going wrong with it, and it appears that the company that owned the game developing studio petitioned to the UK courts to have Digital Jesters liquidated, and eventually this resulted in the publishing deal being canceled. And while the company that owned the developing studio still had rights to the game, and apparently for a while they were seeking out another publishing deal, it didn't seem like they ever found a company willing to publish the game, and the game never actually ended up releasing. The MechAssault games were two really popular game series on the original Xbox, and there was actually a third MechAssault game that was planned for the Xbox 360 that had been pitched by Day One Studios to Microsoft. Not too much is actually known about what ended up happening with the pitch for this game, as it seemed like they also were pitching multiple games at that time in 2012, and then maybe a different game was picked up, which could have been an evolution of MechAssault 3, but then that game may have also fallen apart after the company was acquired by Wargaming, the creators of World of Tanks. And essentially both titles, MechAssault 3 and another title known as Reign of Thunder, never actually released. There was apparently a hack and slash dungeon simulator that was in development between 2006 and 2008 by Firefly Studios, which was supposed to release on the Xbox 360. The company was known for their Stronghold series, and this game never came out, so not too much is known about it other than a few gameplay presentations, and that's about it. Then there was a game known as Amazing Tales Project Caspian, which was an MMO that was planned for the Xbox 360. In the past, the team who was working on this project had made another MMO known as Pirates of the Burning Sea, which was published by Sony Entertainment back for the PC, but since the MMO market was becoming very saturated, they thought maybe on Xbox things could do better. Unfortunately though, the development studio Flying Lab had to close down as money was running out, and over the years some of the assets and prototypes for the game were shared online by developers who had worked on the project, which are now preserved on websites like Unseen64. There was also apparently a run and gun side-scrolling game known as Sentient or Sensory Sweep that was in development in 2008, and it was going to come out on the Xbox 360 Live Arcade, but the project was canceled sometime after it was officially announced, and still not too much is known about it. Ensemble Studios worked on Halo Wars and also that canceled Halo MMO we talked about earlier, but even before that they had another game that they'd been working on for quite some time, known potentially as Wrench. It would have been a car combat game, and it seems like development started pretty early on, maybe for the original Xbox, but later could have been released on the Xbox 360. It was developed, it had a full internal demo, but it ended up getting canceled before being officially announced to the public. There was also a game known as Guerrilla Jungle Revolt, which would have been a co-op shooter game. It would have had a multiplayer component. Apparently there'd be some large-scale battles, an open living world, and free roaming across multiple islands. They were pitching this game alongside some other titles, and essentially Blizzard proposed to them to work on a completely different game, and because of that they just ended up canceling this game altogether, and the game never saw a release. Now also on the original Xbox, there was full intentions at one point or another to have Conker's Bad Fur Day finally get a sequel, that Nintendo 64 classic that was really underrated at its time, and it seemed like there was a bit of effort into making a follow-up game, as even the game had various names associated with it over the years. After the first game was released in 2001, the Rare team started working on a sequel which likely would have been for the GameCube. However, when the Xbox acquisition of 2002 happened, things would have switched over for Xbox. Development of a lot of Rare's games did switch over to the Xbox at this time, like Grabbed by the Ghoulies, Cameo Elements of Power, and likely Conker's Other Bad Day. Now fortunately, much like with a lot of this video, Unseen64 has a great archive of information about what happened to this game, and they even archived an interesting interview quote from Conker's creator Chris Seaver, who even stated that not only did they start working on a sequel with that title in mind, Conker's Other Bad Day, but they also had a full storyline ready to be depicted on the screen and many new movie references in mind. The game would have dealt with with Conker's somewhat unsuccessful tenure as king, he spends all of his treasure money on beer, parties, and hookers, and then he was thrown into prison. Conker is faced with the prospect of execution, and the game starts with his escape, ball and chain attached from the castle's highest tower. In a later interview, he even elaborated even more about the game, saying that graphics and concepts were done for sure, but they didn't get much further than that. Conker would have been the emperor of the known universe, had a new girlfriend and lost an old one. There would have been a massive space poo known as the Cthulhu poo or whatever as the main bad guy. We'd allegedly find out about Greg's childhood and why he hated cats, and there were a ton of parodies of the more contemporary movies that would have been included, such as things like an evil doppelganger version of Conker that you got to play as for a while, and there was even a reveal of some concept art of what that first early design for that first level where you escape from the tower would have been. In 2018, Conker creator Chris Seaver even tweeted out a little hint at one of the concepts he would have had for Conker. Here's how I would have started Conker's other bad day, but instead with a giant panther head flying over the burning ruins of the world you're about to retrospectively journey through. And then he linked this video. Unfortunately, it seems like Microsoft wasn't actually all that interested in a Conker sequel, and soon the team dropped Other Bad Day to work instead on a remake of the first game with a major focus on its online multiplayer mode, assuming that Microsoft thought that the Xbox market would have been more interested in another multiplayer game, and a bonus remake of Bad Fur Day would have been less expensive than to create a full-on sequel. In 2005, Conker Live and Reloaded was published, and there seems to be rumors out there that in late 2004 the team was already trying to return to work on the Conker sequel, and with the launch of the Xbox 360, Microsoft asked Rare to move their projects to the new console, which is what happened with games like Cameo and Perfect Dark Zero. However, it didn't seem like the team working on Conker at the time really wanted to push this project even further back in development for the Xbox 360 release, as it would mean even more time spent working on this project they've already spent years on, and they just wanted to get the game done and finished. It seemed like burnout was really real when it came to this title already. So at the same time, Rare started working on another multiplayer-focused Conker game known as Getting Medieval. It would have been a sequel to Live and Reloaded, reusing some of the assets from what they were working on Conker's Other Bad Day. This game would also end up getting scrapped along with a lot of other projects that Chris Seaver had been working on, and finally he ended up leaving the studio in 2011 before starting his own indie studio called Gory Detail. A few years later though, fans of Conker had one thing coming. Microsoft announced DLC in the form of a full campaign called Conker's Big Reunion for their game tool Project Spark. However, only one chapter was released and the rest of the campaign was discontinued, as all of Project Spark was discontinued as well. But that wasn't it. When it came to Conker, Xbox is like, haha, we have this, we know what the fans want. And in 2016, Microsoft announced Young Conker, which was like an augmented reality game for the Microsoft HoloLens, and they redesigned Conker to look younger, and it is probably the worst thing I think we have ever seen. It is absolutely horrifying to look at. Yeah, rest in peace Conker. Maybe one day Xbox will do something right with a lot of these Rare IPs that kind of disappeared. Also, during the time of this game's cancellation, there was a lot of projects that Rare had been working on or that wanted to work on that started to quickly fall apart. Perfect Dark Zero was a game that was originally being in development for all the way back on the GameCube, and was pushed to the Xbox original and eventually the Xbox 360. It released as a launch title, but the game itself was kind of mixed in reception, definitely not being as praised as the initial Perfect Dark game, and just had a goofier tone overall from the original. After Perfect Dark Zero's release though, the team that had worked on the Perfect Dark games split up into even more smaller teams working on different prototypes. One of these was called The Fast and Furriest, which was a concept that would have utilized the Xbox Live camera to have a movement-based game, and some of the concept images even show screenshots of Rare characters like Conker, TT from Diddy Kong Racing, and Banjo as these terrifying costumes, but you get the idea. Down the road, it seemed like Rare would end up getting pigeonholed into working exclusively on Kinect games despite their talent and original characters that they had under their belt. This concept for a game that never actually released might have actually been Rare sealing their own fate to working on the Kinect exclusively for a while without them even knowing. In the late 2000s, Rare did see a pretty big restructure to their company and their projects that they were working on. There was an MMO project known as Cascade that ended up falling apart, and in the last years of Chris Seaver's time with Rare, he actually was a lead on a project for a Perfect Dark game, which at the time was called Perfect Dark Core. It would have had a very different approach to the series with Joanna Dark, and this time around the character would be a colder, a tougher warrior who, quoting Unseen 64 64 here would have had their own sanity to some extent worn down by years of field work. There would have been a cast of new characters, and eventually even Elvis, the main alien from the original Perfect Dark game, would have shown up and fought alongside Joanna as well. Apparently the prototype for the game had one level mostly completed, but it seemed like the game still wasn't fully greenlit and the project soon would fall apart. Fortunately enough, there have been archival efforts to preserve some of the finished works of this prototype. That is what you guys saw while we were talking about this. Saberman Stampede. This game actually has a really unique story, and I love this one. Now, the roots of this game go all the way back to 1984 when a company called Ultimate Play the Game released a series of games centered around a character called Saberman on consoles like the ZX Spectrum or Commodore 64. Years later, that company would become Rare, and Saberman was one of their lesser known mascots, mostly just having little nods and cameos in other games like Killer Instinct or Banjo-Tooie. In the 90s, Rare worked on Diddy Kong Racing, which is a really popular kart racing game for the Nintendo 64. Honestly, this game is just like a chef's kiss. It's really, really good. And in the early 2000s, Rare was brought on to develop a follow-up game known as Donkey Kong Racing. We even got to see a cool tech demo for this game, and it looked really evolved and more Donkey Kong themed than what Diddy Kong Racing originally did. But even Diddy Kong Racing was originally another game known as Pro-Am Racing, which comes from its roots as another retro game. So there's like a long lineage with what we're talking about right now. Then everything shifted in 2002 when Microsoft acquired Rare, and development on Donkey Kong Racing was seized, obviously because Nintendo had the rights to the property. Instead of fully canceling the game though, they would just rename the project to codename Stampede, and with the news of Microsoft trademarking the name Saberman Stampede, a lot of people thought that maybe they were going to switch and use an old mascot that Rare had the rights to from years earlier, Saberman, once again. It seemed like in the following years, the game went through various iterations and development phases, but the game was still in active development through the Xbox years. At one point, it was even described as a Grand Theft Auto style game, but with animals. But it seemed like the project started to fall apart in 2005, where Microsoft may have realized that the project wasn't really making that much progress besides scenery and 3D models. Not much of an actual game had been developed, so the project ended up getting canceled. Over the following years, there would be footage and concept art leaked from the game, and to this day, people are still in the hunt for lost builds of Saberman Stampede. But interestingly enough, this canceled game wasn't the only game that still had ties directly to Diddy Kong Racing. All the way back in 2001, before the Xbox acquisition of Rare, Nintendo and Rare announced that Diddy Kong Pilot would be coming for the Game Boy Advance as a follow-up to Diddy Kong Racing, but it would just be based on the flying sections of Diddy Kong Racing. Though with the acquisition, Rare ended up losing the rights to Nintendo's characters, and with concerns of quality, backed off the project altogether. So instead, the game was reworked just to include Banjo characters. But you can see even back at this time, it seemed like Rare had a pretty big investment in the future of the kart racing series involving Diddy Kong and Donkey Kong, as two games were simultaneously in development when Xbox came and acquired them. Banjo Pilot would be published by THQ and wasn't received very well, but racing games in a sense were still in Rare's blood here, and development on a Banjo game that would have been exclusively for the Xbox did go underway for a little while, known potentially as Banjo-Kazooie. Not too much is known about the game, but it would have been a kart racer that let you customize vehicles for the races themselves, similar to maybe what we got in Banjo Nuts and Bolts, where you're able to customize vehicles to play through and platform your way through the game, though that game obviously wasn't a racing game. During this time, there was also plans for a third Banjo game, maybe called Banjo 3E or Banjo X, but this game would have actually been a straight remake of the first game, where slowly over time in the game, characters would have broken the fourth wall and gradually became more aware that they were in a remake. This was of course also during the time that Conker was getting its remake. There might have even been plans of a 4-player co-op mode introduced into this game, but it seemed like by the time that this game would have released, it probably would have just felt odd being so many years since the N64 release of the game, and a lot of the team shifted into wanting to do a brand new game, not a remake, and wanted to innovate on the methods of platforming. Tying that together with the build your own kart mechanic that was being worked on for what Banjo-Kazooie would have been, had these two ideas combined, and eventually the game Banjo Nuts and Bolts would be kind of the byproduct of these two canceled projects. Okay, now we can shift gears and take a look at the original Xbox, which is wild in itself with some of the games that were intended for this console that never never got to come to be. There's a gem for the Nintendo 64 called Revolt, which was like an RC car racing game. Not only was the gameplay fun, but man, the main menu music was a banger. And there were plans for a sequel to this game to finally be made that would have added online multiplayer known as Revolt Live. There was even a closed beta, and you can even see the game in the classic Xbox Live commercial, and the commercial, from what it looks like, makes the game look pretty finished and ready for release. It wasn't a bad idea either, because this game was to capitalize on the brand new Xbox Live feature, which would let players connect and play together online, and RC racing was a kind of a unique concept that worked well enough on the Nintendo 64. Unfortunately, Acclaim ended up closing down in 2004 because of bankruptcy, and unfortunately also, Revolt Live would get canceled. Hey, have you ever heard of the little company known as Bungie? They made the game Halo. Well, originally, when Halo was being developed, Bungie didn't know or think that this would become as massively successful as Halo would end up becoming. And because of that, during the time that Halo was wrapping up its development, Bungie already had plans on what they were going to work on next, and likely their follow-up games would have also released on Xbox. Behind the scenes during the end days of Halo Combat Evolved's development was a game known as Project Phoenix, which was going to be Bungie's main focus after they got Halo out the door. Now, Project Phoenix did have a couple names in development that were changed throughout the course of its run. It had the name Breach, and it even got another name that we'll get to in just a second, but this mystery game was speculated to have begun development in 1999, then paused in 2000, with plans for development to resume on a brand new build of the Blam Halo engine sometime after the release of Combat Evolved. Bungie alluded to this, referring to the project from the team formerly known as Myth 2, which led the project to have the nickname TTF-KAM2. And over the following years, some lead developers from other Bungie projects were moved to the Phoenix project, and even during the early days of Halo 2's development, half of Bungie was working on Project Phoenix, which is insane thinking about how tight the deadline with Halo 2 truly was. However, with E3 2003 showing off a demo of Halo 2 that probably couldn't actually be implemented into the game, it became clear with the stakes that Microsoft had put on Bungie for Halo 2 that Halo 2 had to become the new priority, and from there, Phoenix was killed on the spot. Unfortunately, we never saw much of anything besides a logo and this 8-picture concept art gallery that most likely was related to Project Phoenix, though it was never confirmed. The picture shows a heavy dark medieval theme with big battles and maybe even what looks like a boss fight. And nowadays it's been 20 years since the project has been canceled, and while not ever being likely to be revived, Bungie is bringing Marathon back. Maybe they'll revive Myth in the future, and maybe the ideas from Project Phoenix will work their way into that. There still are a lot of people who worked on this project back in the day still at Bungie, so who knows? Maybe we'll see something one day. Next, we can take a look at Gaia Blade. This was an RTS game with RPG elements developed by From Software, announced back in 2001 to be an Xbox exclusive with Xbox Live capabilities in mind. Besides being able to upgrade your bases with traps to defend against AI or online players, and the setting being inspired by Norse and Western fantasy literature, not much is known about the actual game, and it was canceled. The reason for the cancellation is only speculated, but around the time Gaia Blade was canceled, some other games were scrapped at From Software due to them not moving along in development very well, with other projects being more promising. There was also an Xbox exclusive game known as Vultures, which looked like a gladiator fighting game that got some trailers and screenshots, but not much is known besides it looking kind of generic, to be honest. And then there's games like Eon of Tears, which kind of looks like a fever dream, maybe? It was supposed to be a RPG that retold the story of the Bible, and maybe throws in some Greek mythology in there as well. I don't know. In the trailer, you can see Medusa, which I don't think is in the Bible. Oh, and besides it being an RPG, it was supposed to include some survival horror elements. It looked pretty ambitious. I mean, just look at the features that were planned on being included in this game. But hey, maybe it was too ambitious for what the developers could actually make, and it was canceled sometime between 2002 and 2004. What's left of this game are some insane quotes from the developer to describe the game like, quote, "Separating the sea and saving the Hebrew people should be a warm and gratifying feeling for us all, and imagine how it must be like to be Jesus, to see yourself nailed on the cross and to live his life in the best and worst moments." Another game known as Raise the Roof was announced. It was apparently a mech shooter with destructible environments that honestly looks kind of boring, and that all you could tell from the 30 seconds of footage that were ever released was that they showed buildings falling apart. Now, the studio making this game would go on to make a bunch of licensed games for like Disney and Mattel, so they had a very prolific career after this, making games like Hannah Montana Music Jam for the DS or Barbie Magic Genie Bottle for Windows that came with an actual Genie Bottle controller. So I don't think we'll ever see Raise the Roof actually get a release. There was a game known as Mutant Chronicles Warzone Online, which was an MMORPG set in the Mutant Chronicles franchise, which is a pen and paper role-playing game from the early 90s that was announced in 2000 and then was canceled 2 years later. The screenshots look alright, and it's interesting to think that in 2000 there was a console MMORPG like this in development, since console MMOs didn't really become common until the early to mid 2010s. There was another title known as Strident: The Shadow Front, which was a techno thriller game, whatever that means. Strident: The Shadow Front was announced in early 2000s for the Xbox and later PC, and was heavily inspired by Bungie's game Oni. It would have featured similar gameplay, a female lead, 20 missions, and a cyberpunk aesthetic/setting. A trailer was released that looks very early 2000s, but the reason the game was canceled was never given, and the studio would go on to make other Xbox exclusives like 99 Nights. There was also another game known as Duality, which was a third-person stealth game in the same cyberpunk setting that was announced alongside Strident by the same studio publisher and was also canceled around that same time. Then there was Call of Cthulhu Beyond the Mountains of Madness. Now, Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth was a horror FPS released in 2005. The development of that game was so dragged out, they already started working on 2 sequel games during its initial development, one of them being Beyond the Mountains for Xbox, and the other being Destiny's End for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. But neither of those games found a publisher or funding, and the whole studio ended up closing down in 2006. ATV3 Lawless. It's an ATV racing game that was made by Acclaim Entertainment, who are known for making a ton of sports games and ports back in the 90s. There's a prototype build that got leaked onto the internet that is playable if you have the right hardware, but it doesn't look that special, and it's probably why it got scrapped. Shade Monsters v Humans. It was an attempt at a gothic FPS game in the early 2000s by Metro 3D, a studio which, like so many on this list, would close down within a few years. Not much besides some screenshots and a few details were ever released, and to be honest, there really wasn't anything notable that was ever shown off about this title. Fate was a fantasy MMO that was announced to be Xbox's answer to console MMORPGs like Phantasy Star Online for the Dreamcast or Final Fantasy XI Another World for the PS2. But besides one picture showing the world and 3 pictures showing some characters, we don't know how far along development was ever, and it never got very far, obviously, before it got canceled. Next, we have The Roots, which was, once again, another action RPG that got announced for the OG Xbox, and in 2005 it was eventually canceled, but there was a portable version released for the Nokia N-Gage that had its gameplay apparently reworked, but it was co-developed with ideas that were originally inspired for the Xbox version that never actually came. Dang, look at Nokia coming and stealing away some exclusives. Sergeant Cruz was an interesting concept. Quote, "Meet Earth's last hope for survival. He's big, he's strong, he ain't got a lot of brains, but he's got a lot of guns." Those are the opening lines for the trailer of Sergeant Cruz, but I guess we'll never find out if those statements were actually true because the game got swiftly canceled after the studio went bankrupt. Relics: The Absolute Spirit was a potential Xbox sequel to some obscure Japanese 2D side-scroller, but it looks like it never really made it far into development, and there's very little footage of this game out there in existence, which is what we're showing right now. Internal Pain was another sci-fi action game from the early Xbox days. They showed off one tech demo and then the game was canceled. Kel: Fury Unbound. We honestly have no idea what this was supposed to be besides maybe an RPG. There's a YouTube comment that pointed out that you fight maybe mutated chicken enemies. Yeah, that's the main takeaway from this reveal trailer. Well, they had another RPG cooking with Legend of the Sun, and there was more gameplay shown for for that game, but eventually the studio just went defunct in 2001 and all their projects were canceled, so I'm starting to see a recurring theme here. American McGee's Oz. This is a studio most famous for the Alice games. Developer American McGee's wanted to make a similar game, but with the Wizard of Oz franchise. They had high expectations with this franchise since they also announced that toys, a book, and a movie deal will be revealed in the future, and that didn't really work out, and the game itself didn't even make it to release and was canceled before it was ever actually shown off. Johnny Drama was a 3D cartoon game that would have had you play as a spy movie star going up against an evil doctor. It was hyped up with having the real-time cartoon world, whatever that means, and then in the same paragraph they also hyped up the music being reactive to gameplay, but it seems like that was maybe all that was notable or special about this project, and it was canceled as well. Then there was a game called The Unseen, which sometime before 2002 Microsoft approached Tremor Entertainment, a mostly Sega Dreamcast focused developer, to make a game called The Unseen that Microsoft themselves would publish. The Unseen seemed to have been another action RPG type game, and it was canceled in 2002 when Microsoft ended their publishing contract. Despite the name, there was a tech demo and trailer that was shown off, and in an ad was also printed into some of those little pamphlets that would come with some games showcasing what The Unseen would have been. There was an original Xbox game known as Trinity: The Shatter Effect, which was being developed by a studio known as Grey Matter Interactive and published by Activision. It would have been a first-person shooter with some sci-fi elements in it, though in 2003 Activision was kind of going through a rough time as a publisher, and Call of Duty was doing incredibly well, so Activision needed all hands on deck, and this development studio would be merged with Treyarch to begin working on an expansion for Call of Duty known as United Offensive, and this game ended up getting scrapped altogether. There was another game known as Hollow, which was being developed by Zootfly, and this game was internally compared to games like Doom, Halo, or Battlefield 1942, though a year after the game's announcement, it was put on hold by the publishers, and it's speculated that the game being promised as this overambitious title compared to where they actually were in development caused some publishers to not be interested in putting the game out, and the game never saw release. In 2004, there was a game known as Sword of Dracula in development by Critical Mass Interactive for PC and Xbox based on the comic book franchise. Not too much is known about the game, though it was apparently inspired by Call of Duty in terms of gameplay, which is kind of interesting. There was also an early 2001 title known as Arcturus, which was like a spaceship fighting game, and there had been like different sizes of ships that you could fight in that never saw the light of day. Apparently in 2005, there were plans to create a Kill Bill hack and slash type game by Studio Giganti. It would have been developed just for the Xbox and would have just followed the plot of the Tarantino movies. Unfortunately, while they had a prototype working for this game, they couldn't find a publisher to get the game off the ground, and they ended up having to close the project down. Pumpkin Man. I don't even know where to begin with this game. It looks terrifying. It would have been a third-person shooter game, and you play as a dead person named Joshua trying to open the gates of hell to let demons celebrate Halloween on Earth. I don't know. The studio ended up filing bankruptcy before the game could be released, and man, I really wonder what it would have been like. A playable demo did eventually leak online, fortunately, but still, what a concept. Okay, not too many people remember in the early 2000s there was a game known as Tron 2.0, and apparently for a short while there were plans for a Tron 3.0 for the Xbox. Not much is known about what happened to this project, why it wasn't picked up, and whatever happened to it, though there were concept art that did manage to be discovered online. There was a first-person shooter RPG game known as Reprisal, which was made by Power Infused Productions. They were aiming to make a game that was a hybrid of Quake, Thief, and Deus Ex, featuring 3 different playable races. The game seemed to be in the deep prototyping phases. When they couldn't find a publisher interested in the game, the project ended up getting canned. There was a game known as Dead Justice, which was being developed by a studio known as Cat Mother between 2001 and 2003. We don't know too much about the game, but when the team was shutting things down for the project because of a lack of funds, they did release the game online with the source code as a prototype PC demo that anyone could play, so we do get to see a tiny bit of what may be entailed in this game. There was a canceled vehicular combat game known as Battle Rigs, or at another point in development, it was also known as Construction Derby, and it was developed by Rage Software Sheffield. The game never saw an official announcement, though images of this prototype eventually did get shared online. Man, Cthulhu Delta Green, which was developed by Flying Lab for Xbox, actually seemed like a really ambitious horror strategy game that was being planned out, and it seemed like the game was actually getting pretty far in development before the project would inevitably be shut down. Apparently, at one point, Microsoft was really interested in picking up this game as the publisher for it. However, they ended up not following through, and while the studio was working on multiple projects, the game never entered full development and was constantly being shelved in favor of projects that were likely to release, and thus this game just never actually got to come out. There was a Battlefield home delivery game, also known as Senjo no Daime Moki, which apparently was a poetical pizza delivery game. It was in development by Microsoft Game Studios Japan, which I didn't even know existed, and it was planned to be released all the way back on the original Xbox. It did see an official announcement at the game show in 2002 with a live presentation of the game, and the main character would have been a character known as Fran Chan, working as a delivery girl at a pizzeria. You'd have to run through the city delivering pizza. Honestly, the idea looks pretty original and charming in a way. It's a shame it never saw a release. I feel like Xbox could have really benefited from having a weird and quirky, unique game like this exclusively on their platform. A few years back, there was actually a game known as Geox, which was discovered as a development build on a dev kit from a game collector. Not too much is known about this odd game other than the footage we have here, and it's still a mystery to this day as to what ended up happening with this project and who was behind it. But remember, in the early days of Xbox, Microsoft was doing their best they could to try to get gamers on their platform. So there was an idea for a game known as X-Girl, which was a canceled girlfriend simulation game that was being developed by Angel Studios. You know, imagine a game like what I guess Unseen64 says, "Hey you Pikachu," but instead of Pikachu, it's a girlfriend, and it's like the main character you interact with. She didn't use voice commands though, and was more like, I guess, a traditional pet simulator game like a Nintendogs or something. I don't know. It was a weird title. The game never got officially announced, and the only real details we have are very limited, but it's just funny to think that this game could have actually released. The studio then ended up becoming a part of the greater Rockstar and worked on other games like Red Dead Revolver, Midnight Club, and Grand Theft Auto 5. There were two games that were canceled around the same time that would have been really interesting. A game known as Tiltronica, which was like a racing puzzle game, maybe inspired by something like Super Monkey Ball, and Sonic Extreme, which would have been like a Sonic boarding game but for the Xbox before Sonic Riders became an actual thing. Both of these games were just prototypes and never saw the light of day, but still it's interesting that they even existed. There was work on a game that was supposed to be like a hyper realistic, ambitious photography game known as Serengeti, where you were like a photographer in the Serengeti, and I think that would have been it for the game. The game was supposed to have some really innovative AI, and it was supposed to be really ambitious with the visuals. Many people think that this game was way ahead of its time for early 2000s, and with the game not being able to find an easy publisher who would want to take the game to the next level, the game ended up falling through and never was developed. There was apparently a game known as The Guardian, which would have come out on the Xbox, where you would have been a character who died in a car accident, but then you would be a ghost and you have to interact with NPCs and resolve different tasks. Apparently the game had a pretty good playable prototype, but the project still ended up getting canceled in late 2003. A dev kit was discovered for a game known as Storm Riders, which some people speculate could have been inspired by a film or comic with the same name, though the gameplay seems to play somewhat similar to Ninja Gaiden, though not much is actually known about what this game actually was. Fallen Kingdoms was a canceled Western RPG that was announced all the way back in 2004, which would have come out on both the PC and the original Xbox, and would have been maybe something more along the lines of what Baldur's Gate kind of turns out to be, but in a much larger scale, obviously. A little bit was shown off before the game ultimately was canceled too. There was another canceled prototype known as Crazy Car Championship, which was developed by Synaptic Soup in 2001. It never saw the light of day. At E3 2002, another car game known as Objective Force Commander was shown off, but after the E3 reveal, the game was just removed from any upcoming release lists out there, and the game never actually came out, though versus and co-op modes using Xbox Live were planned at one point in development. There was this game known as Oddballs, which I honestly don't even understand what this is, but it was canceled. This game known as Survivors actually sounds really interesting, where you would have been in a digital survival environment and you'd have to survive different historical disasters like the Titanic or a heavy hurricane, or even one other thing that I'm very surprised that they decided to include here. Maybe that's why the game got canceled, due to some of the controversial scenarios they were developing here. Ever want to walk the runway on Xbox? Well, if Style Laboratory would have come out, you would have been able to. Probably because of the low sales of the Xbox in Japan, this game got canceled, but yeah, it would have been like a dress-up game runway experience. There was a game called The Unholy that was first announced all the way back in 1997 for the PC, and later would go into development in 2000 and 2001 for the original Xbox by Otherworlds Interactive, and this would have been one of the very first Xbox exclusives of all time, but after years of development, there never was a publisher found that wanted to pick up this game and risk the money in publishing the game, and it never released. This next game was canceled for unknown reasons, but there was a game known as Knights of Decadin. We know it was in development in at least 2002 and would have had an emphasis on flying ships, but it seemed like a lot of conceptualizing and work was put into making this game as far as it did get in development, but we still don't know what actually would have been there. Then there was an Xbox anime MMO RPG known as Shining Lore. It kind of looked like any anime MMO at the time, but as we know with a lot of the MMOs on this list, it didn't come into fruition. There was a game called Oddworld, The Brutal Ballad of Fangus Clot. I don't even know what this is, but this would have been a canceled sequel to the Oddworld games, and when it was first announced on gaming news sites, people thought it was an April Fool's joke. But then later, concept art surfaced, and it was confirmed to have been something that was real, but then also that it got scrapped. Then there was the elusive Y Project. Now, this game started out as an FPS where you shoot aliens, but after some development trouble, it became a game about alternate history where like Germany won World War II and took control over the world, which kind of sounds like, you know, Wolfenstein nowadays, but this was back in 2000, so it was a unique idea. But maybe that was a little too ahead of its time, and it seemed like they had trouble finding a publisher to fund this project, and the original funding had fallen through for the game. There was a game called Citizen Zero Big World. This game would have put you on a different planet on what seems to be a new human colony maybe, and you'd have to learn to adapt to the new environment. This game was in development for quite some time, and the development was eventually moved to the 360, but eventually ended up getting canceled. Kung Fu Story for the Xbox. This would have been a sequel to the game Kung Fu Chaos, which the first game didn't do too well, so they canceled the sequel and moved on to other projects. There was Gemini, which was an interesting concept, as in the game you would have made your way up a tower that connected Earth to a space station, kind of like a space elevator from Halo, but not too much else is known about this game, and it ended up getting canceled. Then there was this game called Xavier Fox. Seems like some furry game. It had some screenshots, but it's mostly lost media nowadays. Maybe it was like a knockoff Star Fox. We really don't know too much, but yeah, this one also never saw the light of day. And after all of that, those are most of pretty much every canceled game that was supposed to come as an exclusive to the Xbox. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. Also, it's time for you to get your Gamer Supps refilled, or if you've never tried Gamer Supps, it's time to get started. It's a great source for energy. It has a ton of caffeine to just get you through, but it's sugar-free, so it's a great alternative to drinking soda, which probably isn't the best thing for you. If you're drinking like 5 or 6 sodas a day, you might want to try to look for an alternative, and I honestly, genuinely suggest Gamer Supps. Use our code, it supports our channel, and you get a discount. So win-win. I'm an avid drinker of this stuff, so it's a cool way to support our channel. Thanks so much for everyone who watched this far. Huge shout out to our patrons for supporting our content and videos like this. You guys are legends. If you want to have your name listed as a producer, go ahead and check out our Patreon down below. Throwing a couple bucks our way also supports this channel, and we're making new types of content like this, so literally any dollar thrown our way actually helps substantially. All right, that's it for today. We'll see you guys next time with a new video.